In this lecture, I'm going to discuss the problem of archaeology pertaining to the book of Joshua. In particular, the problem of reconciling what is known archaeologically about Jericho and Ai, cities according to the book of Joshua taken by the Israelites, and the archaeological evidence as it has been found by archaeologists. We know where the city of Jericho is. It is modern-day Tel Sultan. Here's an aerial photograph of it. Now, according to the book of Joshua, Joshua conquered the city of Jericho after the walls came tumbling down. Biblical chronology would suggest a date of around 1400s BC, if you take the early date of the Exodus, or 1200s BC, if you take the late date. According to the Bible, Joshua marched around the city 7 times, blew the trumpet, and the walls collapsed. And then he was able to rush in and take the city. Now, when Jericho was excavated by Kathleen Kenyon, who did excavations in the years 1952 through 1961, she came to a conclusion which was not welcome by those of us who have a high view of the Bible and biblical history. She concluded that Jericho, at the time of Joshua, which would have been the late Bronze Age, the late Bronze Age is dated nominally to 1550 BC to 1200 BC, which, by the way, incorporates both the early date and the late date of the Exodus. Anyway, during the years 1550 to 1200 BC, the late Bronze Age, she concluded that Jericho was an unwalled village. In other words, there was no walls of Jericho to come tumbling down at the time the Bible says that Joshua conquered the city. And thus, Kenyon concluded that the Bible's accounts are inaccurate. Now, Kenyon rejected the conclusion of an earlier archaeologist, a fellow by the name of John Garstang, who also had done excavations of Jericho before Kenyon did. He found a burn line, and he concluded that that burn line dated to around 1400 BC, and attributed that burn line to Joshua's conquests. Kenyon, on the other hand, argued that this burn line should be dated earlier to around 1550 BC, before the time that Joshua could have taken the city. And she related it to the time of the expulsion of the Hyksos from Egypt, and didn't think that the destruction of the city related to that burn line had anything to do with Joshua. Now, there's a related problem of the next city that the Israelites are said to have taken, the city of Ai. The city of Ai is usually identified with a site called Et Tel, and there were excavations done there. The important ones are from 1964 through 1966, and again 1968 through 1972. There was an earlier excavation in 1933 through 1935. Here's an aerial view of modern Et Tel. It was excavated by Joseph Calloway in the years 1964 to 1972. And he concluded that in the time of the Middle and Late Bronze Age, which would date to 2200 BC to 1200 BC, that Ai was an abandoned site. Hence, there was no city of Ai during the time that Joshua is said to have conquered Jericho, and Ai, for Joshua to have conquered. It was an abandoned site. Now, this has led more liberal scholarship, critical scholarship, to argue that the biblical accounts are inaccurate. A couple of scholars by the name of Albrecht Alt and Martin Note, both German scholars, argued that the stories of Joshua are what they called aetiological stories. That is, they were stories meant to explain the origin of things, but are not stories meant to actually tell the history of what happened. Thus, in the view of Alt and Note, Joshua's conquest stories are aetiologies, that is, legendary or folklore accounts to explain the origin of things. So you have a couple of ruins. Well, how'd they get to be ruins? Well, they made up stories to explain how these sites became ruins, even though the real story was long since forgotten. As it turns out, the city of Ai in Hebrew seems to mean something like heap or heap of ruins. And so Alt and Note suppose that these stories about Ai were made up to explain how it came to be a heap of ruins. Now, how do we who are more conservative approach these matters? Well, a couple of things we want to say. Well, first of all, liberal scholarship often uses archaeology to disprove the Bible. Conservative scholarship will sometimes use archaeology to prove the Bible. The truth of the matter is archaeology isn't well suited to do either one of those things, at least not convincingly. It more illustrates the Bible than it does either prove or disprove it. In the case of archaeology in general, we should mention that there are limits to what archaeology can do. Only a small percentage of possible excavations have been done. Some excavations have been done poorly, thus destroying the evidence. Erosion can make it difficult to interpret a site. Ancient construction projects, such as wells or pits or leveling, can obscure the evidence. And some materials don't preserve well. So if writing was done on papyrus, which is a type of paper, or parchment, well, almost all of that stuff does not survive. Only in very special dry conditions, like in Egypt or along the Dead Sea, can papyrus or parchment last for many, many centuries. And sometimes sites can be misidentified. Well, you think you're digging a particular site, and it turns out that that's not the correct site. It was actually down the road a bit. Now, archaeology by nature involves considerable interpretation where the presuppositions of the archaeologist can strongly affect the conclusions. So, coming back to the problem of Jericho, well, what about Kenyon's view that Jericho was an unwalled city? Well, Bruce Watke, Old Testament, evangelical Old Testament scholar, argued that, well, perhaps the problem is erosion, that there had been a wall there, but erosion has taken it away, and that's obscured the evidence. So that would be one possibility. A couple of other scholars, J.J. Bimson and Bryant Wood, argued that Kenyon's dating of that burn line is wrong, and it turns out that Garstang was right in the first place. Garstang found a burn line which he dated to the late 1400s BC. Kenyon wanted to date it earlier to the 1550 BC. But if you could date that to the 1400s BC, that would be compatible at least with the early date of the Exodus. Here's how they argue. Well, Bimson argues that the whole dating of the late Bronze Age needs to be recalculated. Well, how do you do dating? Well, the way you do dating, at least in relative chronology, is that you do pottery typology. If you have a certain set of pottery styles, you will tend to date things to that period. Because pottery styles change in a region over time in kind of the same sequence. So if you have a pottery style on one side, at one site, and you go to another site and find a level with the same pottery style, the same pottery typology, well then that would be approximately the same time period. And thus pottery gives you good relative dates, but absolute dates involve tying the pottery to datable things. And what Bimson argues is that the charts are off by a bit. So again, going back to he would like to start the late Bronze Age more like 1400 BC rather than 1550. Now, not many people have followed Bimson in his revision, but that would be one way of solving the problem. Another way of solving the problem is given by Bryant Wood, who simply argues that Kathleen Kenyon misinterpreted the evidence. He did a carbon-14 dating of the burn line, and it came to 1410 BC, plus or minus 40 years. Well, that's again compatible with the early date of the Exodus. He found scarab seals of pharaohs that date to the 1500s and 1400s and 1300s, again providing evidence that 1400 wouldn't be a bad date for that burn line. Even Kathleen Kenyon acknowledged that there was a wall related to that burn line that came tumbling down. She ascribed the fall of that wall to an earthquake, but again dated it to 1550 BC. But if you date it down to the late 1400s, that may very well be the wall that Joshua breached and conquered the city through. As for the problem of Ai, there's a couple of possible solutions there. One solution is to say that Et Tel is the wrong site. Bimson and Woods suggested that Kir Bet Nisya or Kir Bet Katir were the real site. Here it shows Kir Bet Nisa, which is a little about 1 kilometer west of Et Tel, south and west. And if that's the case, then there is some evidence of occupation during the late Bronze Age for that site. This would involve also moving the location of Bethel from Betin to El Bereh. Well, that hasn't yet been proven, but that's at least a possible alternative. By the way, a teacher of mine, Matityahu Savat, suggested that maybe the problem at Et Tel was maybe they're just digging at the wrong place. Another option is to say that Et Tel was more of a temporary outpost rather than a permanently rather than a permanent city. Maybe it was a ruin, but when they saw the army attacking Jericho, the people at Betin went to Et Tel, which was a strategic location coming up the mountain pass, up the well below sea level at Jericho. You have to go up the mountains to get to Bethel or Betin, and perhaps they fortified Et Tel very quickly to stop the invading armies from passing through to attack them. Now, if it was a very quickly set up fortification, it would not be expected to leave much in terms of permanent archaeological remains. So, in both the case of Jericho and Ai, either erosion in the case of Jericho, or perhaps more likely misinterpretation of the data by Kathleen Kenyon and accepting the early date of the Exodus, can solve that problem. Et Tel, either it was a temporary outpost, or perhaps it's one of these alternative sites rather than Et Tel as the original site, which is why they didn't find any late Bronze Age evidence. But in either case, it's not a necessary conclusion that the biblical accounts are legendary or inaccurate. There are plausible alternatives to that negative conclusion. And this ends our discussion of the archaeology of Jericho and Ai as relates to the book of Joshua.